Listen to the Magnolias by Stella Gibbons. Mrs. Bestwick lay in the big bed, which she had continued to sleep in after the death of her husband, because it reminded her so comfortingly of him, and trembled with fear. Not violently, so as to shake the bed, or cause the glass to tinkle against the water bottle on the table, but gently, as Mrs. Bestwick did everything, and unceasingly, underneath the fresh warm blankets and the newly cleaned eiderdown and the sheet, which only that morning she had repaired by machining together its two unworn edges. The hour was 3 in the morning, and the Midland night lay stilly along the streets and pressed on the wet roofs of Wapminster. There was not a sound outside, not even a cat wailing, or the distant step of a fire-watcher walking home from the post. The blacked-out lamps, rusted into their 4-year disuse, curved like graceful iron flowers, high and unseen, above the blackness in roads and avenues, and the Wap slid between its banks and past the blue-stained, crumbling basements of the old town, without a ripple or a gleam. The big bakery was at work, bursting with heat and light behind its shutters, and the staff of the Wapminster Recorder had only just finished putting the paper to bed and gone home to its own. But Dynford Avenue, where Mrs. Bestwick lived, was at least a half-mile from both, and on the fringes of the town. The silence was complete. But Mrs. Bestwick could hear sounds, bestial, terrifying sounds, as she lay and trembled in her bed. She heard long-drawn puffing and bubbling noises, sonorous honkings, deep sighs that partook of the nature of moans, and sometimes the fling of heavy bodies which, disturbed by dreams so gruesome that even the thick mufflings of sleep could not keep them out, heaved over and jarred the wall against which the beds rested. She was familiar with snores because her husband had sometimes snored, and they had passed mild recurrent jokes about it, but this seemed to her more than an ordinary forcing of human breath through the mouth and nostrils during slumber. It summed up and embodied in its gross texture all the fears which had oppressed her for the past month. They were here. They were under her roof. They were sleeping in the second-best bedroom of the spare room. Their snores proved it. But every 20 minutes or so, when she awoke with a start out of uneasy sleep, she found it impossible to believe that they were here. And oh, how she dreaded the coming of daylight. If only this night, even with its snores and fear and trembling, could go on forever. It was almost exactly a month ago to the day that her help, Mrs. Corder, looking maliciously over the rim of a cupful of pungent copper tea, had said, "Terrible about these Yanks, isn't it?" And Mrs. Bestwick had answered in her flat, weak voice, "Something in the paper, is it? I haven't seen the sketch yet." "It was my milkman told me. Course you wouldn't have the same one as we do, not living up here. They're going to billet them, all over the town," he said. "Haven't you had no one round asking how many rooms you got on that? My daughter has, down our way." Mrs. Corder lived in one of the poor streets over the bridge, where the river sometimes flooded into the basements, and she hated Mrs. Bestwick for owning a sound house and all those fiddling bits of brass that were such a trouble to clean. And Mrs. Bestwick, looking with mild blue eyes at her help's exhausted face that was yellow with the hunger which its owner did not recognize, knew that Mrs. Corder hated her. But the knowledge did not penetrate into that part of her mind where her few sparse, prim thoughts lived. "We did have somebody asking me how many rooms there were, but that was months ago." "Oh, there was down our way last week. Didn't take me long to tell 'em I've only got one room," I said, "so don't you try putting any of your Yanks in with me," I said. And Mrs. Corder gave a loud laugh. "But they're after the big houses, that's what they're after," the milkman said, "the big houses." "You can't call this a big house. You've got 4 bedrooms. "Yes, but you can't call 4 bedrooms a big house." "Some would." Mrs. Corder poured out more tea and stirred into it an eighth of Mrs. Bestwick's sugar ration, while keeping one eye fixed on Mrs. Bestwick. "Oh, well, you must hope for the best, that's all. I can't say as I'd like Yanks in my house. If I had a house, that is, I mean. I've heard they're terrible." When Mrs. Corder had gone off to smear the drawing-room, Mrs. Bestwick had stood looking vaguely at the red Japan tea canister with its picture of a Japanese girl carrying a parasol, and then she looked slowly round the kitchen, and, as usual, she felt that something was missing from it. And again, as usual, it took her almost half a minute to realize that the something was Gertrude. Gertrude had been her maid. She was dead now, and that was another thing. It was very difficult, almost impossible, for Mrs. Bestwick to believe. But she had been with the Bestwicks for 10 years, and after Mr. Bestwick had died, 10 years before the war broke out, she had been a comfort to Mrs. Bestwick and the kitten, who, apart from business connections and some distant relations, were his sole mourners. So that, altogether, made 20 years. Gertrude had changed from a round-faced, plain girl to a fat-faced, ugly woman in Mrs. Bestwick's service. She had seemed satisfied at 14 Dynford Road. Happy was a word not used there. But one morning in 1943, she had gone out to do the shopping as usual, and had come back 3 hours later with her abundant reddish-grey hair cut short under a new hat with a military peak, talking wildly and with an even wilder expression in her eyes about going away into a camp to cook for the soldiers. It was all, she'd said, that she could do. And before Mrs. Bestwick could get over her astonishment sufficiently to dissuade her, she had gone. Left alone, Mrs. Bestwick, though considerably shaken by the event, had too much good sense to wear out her declining strength with housework, although she took it for granted that the domestic standards to which she had always been accustomed should be kept up, and soon she obtained, by means of a sixpenny card displayed in a newsagent's in the High Street, the services of Mrs. Corder, who was too old to be of use in any of the town's new small arms factories. From that hour, crumbs and smears and dust obtained a footing in 14 Dynford Road. But although Mrs. Bestwick noticed them all and was distressed by every one, she did not mind them so much as might have been expected. When confronted by them, she usually thought how shocked Gertrude would have been at the sight, and this comforted her, as if she had in some way passed her burden onto Gertrude's broader shoulders. Mrs. Bestwick was not fond of writing long letters, but she had written regularly to Gertrude once a fortnight, telling her about the latest accomplishments of the kitten, and faithfully recording the gradual decaying of the household equipment beneath the pressure of war. And Gertrude had as faithfully answered in short messages, scrawled on bent and grubby picture postcards. Mrs. Bestwick spent much of her time while she was knitting the wine-coloured or biscuit-coloured jerseys which she favoured. Colours which were far indeed from suggesting the burnt glow of one or the sugary crispness of the other. In wondering how Gertrude was really getting on in those camps, and she had only that day written and posted a letter saying that Gertrude must come on a visit to her former place the next time the army gave her leave, when the other letter came, from Gertrude's brother, saying that she had been killed in an air raid. This news really did shake Mrs. Bestwick to the depths of her soft, dim, kindly nature, and she began to feel a trembling dread of violence and change. She began to await with terror the distant thudding of guns defending the big aeroplane factories 10 miles to the north, and to brood over the news in the papers, while, as if to console herself, and in some way which she did not try to explain, also to console the dead Gertrude, she tried to draw more closely about herself and the kitten, who was now a stout and handsome cat, the shreds of their former orderly life. As she lay trembling under the coverings through which the snoring from behind the presumably closed doors of the other bedrooms and her own locked one penetrated with insolent ease, she remembered that she had started being afraid about the Americans from the first day that Mrs. Corder had spoken about them. For nearly 10 years no man had looked at Mrs. Bestwick, who would be 57 years old in the coming April, with interest. Mr. Bestwick, of course, had been different. He was her husband, so naturally he had looked at her with interest. Although the full pale cheeks and the full blue eyes of her youth had been allowed by her to lose their mild beauty without recourse to the witch doctor's paraphernalia of the beauty specialists. She was not a pretty aging woman. She dressed her hair in an unadventurous roll about her head, and covered her flat body with the bright flowered garments in summer and the tailored woolen ones in winter, which English women prefer. And she, no longer, of course, looked at men with shy interest under the thick eyelashes of youth. Much of her fear of the Americans was caused by a secret conviction that men belonged not merely to the other sex, but to another race than the human. Had she lived 100 years ago, she would certainly have called them horrid creatures, and it had come to be silently agreed between herself and Gertrude that they were fortunate to live in a house untroubled by the presence of these large, mysterious, and perpetually hungry beings. When one or the other chanced to hear a piece of local gossip concerning some selfish son or unsatisfactory brother, they would exchange significant glances which congratulated themselves upon their good luck. Any small comfort which Mrs. Bestwick did obtain during the increasingly harassing month while she awaited the blow to fall and her house to be chosen had come from imagining how cross and upset Gertrude would have been at the prospect of American soldiers tramping with dirty boots over her clean floors. Mrs. Bestwick did not confide her increasing terror to any of her friends and acquaintances, because she was sure that they would laugh at her and would not understand how she felt. No other housewife in Dynford Avenue was in exactly the same position as herself, widowed and bereft of her faithful servant by a whim of the latter which had ended in her death. Most of them had husbands and grown-up children who could help them to endure the ordeal, and the few who were unmarried, though they expressed fears that their rooms would be damaged and their peaceful routine interrupted, somehow conveyed to Mrs. Bestwick the conviction that they were rather looking forward to the prospect. They were not likely, she felt, either to understand or to sympathize. Then there was a question of being patriotic. Mrs. Bestwick knew quite well that she ought to welcome this opportunity of doing something for the American boys, when everyone had been so kind all over the world to our boys, wherever they went. But somehow she could not think of the threatened Americans as boys. She imagined them as small, square, ageless men in slouch hats, the doughboys whom, as a young woman, she had watched marching through London nearly 30 years ago, and alarmingly tough and leathery they had looked. Make such creatures fruit flans? Get out the best doilies for them. They would sneer at the first and tear the second in fragments with their teeth. And yet it was her duty to lay both before them with a willing heart. Her misery was increased by the gnawings of conscience. Misery and apprehension could not ward off the day when a large, mechanically polite billeting officer banged the knocker of 14 Dynford Avenue, almost through its front door, and, standing at a height of some 9 feet above Mrs. Bestwick, and looking straight through the hall, with its brass and ferns mercilessly exposed to his indifferent eye, asked her how many bedrooms she had. Having drooped his head by some 3 feet to catch the faltering reply that she had 4, and having demanded how many of them were occupied, and received the answer 1, in a voice which modesty made even fainter than usual, he shuffled through some papers, and then announced that on a certain date she could expect 5 soldiers to be billeted upon her, for whom she must supply certain meals, and for whose keep she would receive money. Then he went on to the next house, leaving Mrs. Bestwick to shut the door slowly with terror and despair in undisputed possession of her feeling. 5! After this ominous visitation, the days began to pass with nightmare speed, and yet to contain long hours, it seemed to her, in which to brood and worry. What would they eat? Baked beans, Mrs. Harewood at number 22 assured her, and ice cream and fried chicken. None of them easy things to get nowadays, but we didn't want the American boys to carry back a bad impression of us, did we? No, murmured Mrs. Bestwick, thinking that she did not care, if only they would carry themselves back as well. What would she talk to them about? Would she ever be able to have a bath again? Of the other place, she dared not think. And who would clean their boots? She knew that English soldiers cleaned their own buttons because she had once been to tea with Mrs. Lester at number 17 when her son Robert was home on leave, and had seen him doing it with the help of a neat and curiously attractive little device, which prevented the polish from staining his uniform. But what did American soldiers do about their boots? 10 boots! And the American army was sure to have higher standards than the English one. She would still be polishing boots while they were rushing out of the bathroom shouting for their breakfasts. If only they had not been American. That added the final touch of exotic horror to the situation. She doubted if she would be able to understand what they wanted, for on the rare occasions when she went to the pictures, she had difficulty in hearing what Americans said, because they talked so fast and used such funny expressions. And if she couldn't understand what they wanted, it would mean, being men, that they would always be cross. She became more silent and drawn as the dreaded day approached. And Mrs. Corder, who had got the news out of her, added to her unhappiness by telling frightening stories about the habits and needs of Yanks, salting her report with hints about one thing at least, which they would not be requiring from Mrs. Bestwick or herself. On the morning of the day when they were expected, Mrs. Bestwick went shopping. She bought 15 doughnuts and a pound of coffee and 5 small American flags, and she also called for the 2 tins of baked beans which the grocer had promised to let her have, and the grocer actually kept his word. Chickens were £2 each, and it was not economy that made her decide against the purchase of a bird so meagre that it would have scarcely provided a full meal for 2, let alone 5. When she returned home, she found Mrs. Corder sullenly flinging the clean bedclothes onto the last of the 5 beds. It was late February, and all the flowers that Mrs. Bestwick could find were cultivated white narcissi that looked sickly but smelt sweet, and she spent 10 shillings on them. The day drew on. Mrs. Corder finished her 2 hours and left. Some 10 minutes before that event was strictly due, and Mrs. Bestwick sat down to her lunch, presented on a lace mat and supported by a napkin in its ring, and ate. Rain began to fall, and a mist settled down over the streets, and with it a weeping hush. The house grew so dark that Mrs. Bestwick had to turn on the lights while she arranged the flowers in the room, and printed some 6 notices on postcards, saying, "To the kitchen, bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, private. Please make yourselves comfortable," and finally, "Welcome to an English home." These she arranged in the appropriate places, with the last mentioned placed conspicuously in the hall beside the American flags, stuck into the last one, and the largest of some apples, which she had been storing since September. It was wrinkled now, but it was a Cox's pippin, and still looked a good apple. When she had arranged the doughnuts and the coffee, with saucepan, milk, sugar and matches, cups and plates on the kitchen table, the time was 4:30. It was not quite dark, and the rain had stopped. She drew the black curtains over the windows, shutting out the lowering dark blue sky, and one dim yellow streak in the west, and carried a tray upstairs to the drawing-room, and drank the tea sitting by the fire, because she always took her tea so in winter-time, and as if her heart had not been striking hard with terror against her side since early afternoon. No sounds came from the distant town. After the distant click or clap of 6 front doors being shut, with varying degrees of loudness up and down the road at intervals, behind Mr. Simmons, Mr. Payne, Mr. Robertson, Miss Gaynor, and young Arthur Mickleham, returning from business or from school, there were no sounds in Dynford Avenue. The wirelesses were going, but the sound walls of houses built in 1906 kept out their noise. The cat had insisted, with the heartlessness characteristic of his race, on being let out as usual, heedless of Mrs. Bestwick's quavering warning that she would not be able to leave a window ajar, and that the kitchen might be full of nasty men when he returned. And after his fluff-fringed posterior had vanished into the damp twilight, the house was quiet indeed. Mrs. Bestwick looked at the clock in the kitchen, and it said 5:15. She had not dared to ask the billeting officer what time the men would be arriving, and uncertainty had added its unwelcome presence to her harassing day. But now she knew at least that they would not be here until after dark, and that everything was ready for them. She went across the kitchen, where she had gone to let out the unchivalrous cat, and picked up the large tray she had prepared for herself, with thermos flask and hot water bottle and biscuits. The situation was too upsetting for her to dream of eating some sandwiches, which, in happier times, she had always welcomed an excuse for doing. She added the new numbers of the Lady and the Wapminster Recorder and her electric torch, and climbed slowly upstairs to her bedroom. She came down once more for a last inspection of the banked yet cheerful fires in kitchen and drawing-room, and opened the doors of the soldiers' bedrooms a mere 2 inches to see that the electric stoves were burning steadily. The narcissi were looking delicately at her through the red dusk, and even scenting the air a very little. Then, having nervously made her toilet, she went into her bedroom, and, as if it were already 10 o'clock, began to retire. It was peaceful in the large chill room with the white furniture and pink walls and carpet, and at 8 o'clock, while she was sitting in bed drinking tea with the hot water bottle at her feet and the recorder's mild pages spread out before her, she forgot for 5 minutes what was going to happen later that evening, and enjoyed the occasion. But when she did remember, the return of misery was so acute that she would rather not have had the respite. When all the tea had gone, and she had finished both Lady and Recorder and the biscuits, she put out her bedside lamp and lay down, as she always did at 10:30, to sleep. But at once she began to listen, a thing she never did unless there was a warning on. She listened intently into the mild, damp darkness stretching beyond the thick curtains at the window, but there was not a sound, not a footfall, nor a sigh of the wind through bare trees, not even the distant whistle of a train going through on its way to the north, for there was no wind to bring the sound from the main line station 5 miles away, and the lorries coming down from Birmingham did not begin their far-off, intermittent droning until after midnight. She was listening for 2 sounds, the grinding of approaching heavy wheels and the tramp of marching feet. But as 11 drew near and there was no sound, she began to hope. There might have been a mistake. The billeting officer might have decided after all that her house was not suitable. The 5 soldiers might have been sent somewhere else. She might yet awaken in the morning to find herself alone in her house. But at this thought she was not as relieved as she ought to have been. If they did not come tonight, they would come tomorrow, and then she would have no excuse for being in bed and would have to receive them. And the doughnuts would be stale, and the stoves would have shockingly wasted current all night for nothing, and the narcissi would surely be withered, and the Cox's pippin, no longer in its prime, and compelled even so to support 5 American flags, would have become brown and unattractive. No, having been worked up to, and having worked 14 Dynford Avenue up to this pitch of welcome, for heaven's sake, thought Mrs. Bestwick, lying in bed listening, let them come. And even as if this challenge flung down to fate had been overheard and accepted, at that very moment a growling and clanking began to swell in the distance, out on the road leading to Glogby Camp, faintly at first, so that Mrs. Bestwick could not be certain if she were hearing it, and then rapidly as the lorry approached the edge of the town. When Mrs. Bestwick heard it reach the corner of the avenue, which was just far enough distant from the house for her purpose, she got out of bed very quickly, stepped into her slippers standing ready, and ran across the room and downstairs and along the dim, chilly hall, catching up, as she pattered past the table, the key of the front door, which she had detached from its steel ring and strung upon a loop of coarse white twine. Pausing only to switch off the light, she opened the door quickly, and leaning half round it into the cold, damp air, with thudding heart and compressed lips and forehead wrinkled deeply by anxiety, she looped the key round the door's ornamental knob, Then she shut the front door, switched on the light as she passed it, and quickly retreated up the stairs and into her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The agreeably warm patch in the middle of the bed had not had time to cool, and she settled herself down into it with as much relief as she could feel amidst the bodily sensations of fear. But now the dark room seemed to dissolve about her, and its well-known furniture and pictures too, and the only sensation she felt was one of listening. All of her was listening, and the very walls of the house seemed to be melting away so that they were no longer a protection from what was coming. The lorries, there was more noise than one would make by itself, turned the corner and came clanking and grinding down between the houses, and then they stopped, one after the other, and almost at once the street echoed with men's voices, the stamp of feet on stone, and the slamming of doors. But Mrs. Bestwick, although hearing all these sounds, was waiting for the click of her own gate, and footsteps along her own path, and voices outside her front door, and the sounds going on outside other people's houses, the shouted words of command and the bumping of heavy packs on the pavement, did not frighten her, because they seemed not to have anything to do with her. But presently, while the voices and stamping and the subdued hoarse instructions were at their loudest under the black night, she did hear the unmistakable click of her own gate latch being dropped into its socket, and then how heavily and determinedly footsteps advancing down the gravel path and stopping before the front door. Then silence. But she was listening so strainedly that in a minute she heard the soldiers whispering. Their whispers were extraordinarily deep, though soft-sounding, and they floated up to her through the distant clamour of voices and steps in the street in a low-pitched, intermittent buzzing which was musical. That was the unexpected word which came into her head, and then she imagined the men consulting between themselves whether they should knock at the door. But very soon they found the key on its string, for she heard the front door open. Then it closed again, gently, and, as it were, cautiously. Now they were actually in the house. They were being very quiet. They were moving slowly about, reading her postcard notices, cautiously opening doors, peering into empty rooms. She heard boards creaking, loud footsteps moving along the passage to the kitchen, and then the distant deep burr of their voices. The house seemed full of them. It was as if there were 15 soldiers in each room, and all that she silently prayed for, as she lay there huddled and shaking, was that they would not want something that she had forgotten to put out for them and come knocking on her locked door. Later, very late, it was almost 1 o'clock, she heard them creeping ponderously up the stairs to bed. It seemed that the heavy murmur of their talking had been going on behind the kitchen door for many hours, and she had dropped off while listening to it, into the first of those unrefreshing dozes, of which she was to have many during the wretched night. Now nothing was between her and them but her frail door. Her skin broke into a light sweat, and at this startling dampness on her brow, her natural English gentleness, touched sturdily with common sense, for the first time reminded her that most people were nice, and why should American boys, who had come over here to help us fight Hitler, not be as nice as our own boys were? But the comforting thought was almost literally drowned by a gurgling and rushing of taps and flushes that went on, by Mrs. Bestwick's own reliable watch, consulted by torchlight, for 1 hour and 8 minutes. They must have used every drop of water in the tank 5 times over, she thought. Poor boys, I expect they were dirty. So will the bath be, and the towels, and the bathroom floor. Perhaps the water will go through the drawing-room ceiling. She dozed off again. She was awakened by the flinging about and the snoring already described, and at first she could not for the life of her imagine what the sounds were. Had the soldiers got drunk? Were they fighting? Were they ill? There were moaning sounds, and prolonged, undulating, shuddering roars that ended in muffled gobblings, and they were all doing it, because she counted 5 separate and distinct sources of sound. When she realized that they were only snoring, her relief brought tears to her eyes, and although the heavy reverberations along the enclosed air of the house prevented her from even dozing as deeply as she had done before they began, what sleep she had was not so troubled by sensations of fear. The last time she opened her eyes it was 5 o'clock, and the snoring had been succeeded by a silence so awful and complete that it suggested they had all suddenly died. Acting upon her exhausted nerves like a powerful drug, it caused her to fall instantly and deeply asleep. She was awakened by a smell so rich and strong that it penetrated through the door of her room and assailed her senses while she was yet slumbering, and while she slowly and obediently opened her eyes in response to its summons, she did not at first experience it as anything but a disembodied deliciousness. Then she recognized the scent of brewing coffee. She looked languidly at the window curtains and saw that the pale but bright sun of late February was beating gently against them, and even shining through their worn patches strongly enough to fill the room with a dim, goldenish light. And downstairs, in the distance, a man's voice was singing, a song both sad and happy, contented in spite of its mournfulness, as if someone sat lazily at a window to watch warm rain drifting down from a low sky. Mrs. Bestwick was very surprised, and sat up the better to listen. In a little while she got out of bed, and having dressed her hair before the mirror now reflecting the chill brightness of morning, and put on her clothes, she cautiously unlocked the door and sped along to the bathroom. The floor had been wiped dry, with what, she didn't know. The towels were wet, but had plainly been wrung out and were arranged with precision along the rail. The bath was clean, and everything was in order. She made her toilet, and then, breathing fast, and deciding, because of various hopeful signs, that there was no reason why the first meeting should not be got over with now, she crept rapidly, if such a gait can be imagined, down the stairs and towards the sound of singing. The smell of coffee and the deep voice came together to meet her, winding along the 12 feet or so of passage leading into the kitchen. And this morning the usually chilly air of the place seemed warm to her, and she was so confused by the singing, for no one had sung out loud in 14 Dynford Avenue since Gertrude had been a girl of 20, that she thought of the sound as being the colour of the coffee that was scenting the air. But in fact, she hardly knew what she was thinking as she gently turned the handle of the kitchen door. As she slowly, hesitatingly opened it, the singing stopped, but not hastily or guiltily. It only died off into a casual murmur and then ceased. She pushed the door wider open and looked in. The first object that caught her eye was the fire, burning more brightly and fully and redly than she ever remembered to have seen it in Gertrude's day, and then the winking and sparkling of every newly polished bit of polishable metal in the room jumped out at her in welcome, and the gleams were reflected, it seemed to her, in 10 shining boots arranged in a row along the floor. They were brown, but the 5 faces turned towards her, as the soldiers looked up from the various tasks about which they were employed, were black, so black that they seemed to increase the dusk of Mrs. Bestwick's Edwardian kitchen. In the smiling voice of the soldier who first spoke to her, she seemed to hear confusedly many sounds which she knew from her reading of novels belonged to the American South. She heard Magnolias, and a bird called the oriole, and even saw in some strange way the pink and gold flesh of ripe melons. "Good morning, ma'am," and the murmuring deep chorus of last night drawlingly echoed his words. "Do you take tea for your breakfast, or coffee?" And her amazed thought was that in spite of the darkness added to the kitchen, she had never before seen it full of light. That was Listen to the Magnolias by Stella Gibbons. So this is the part of the podcast where I say something about the author and then something about my reaction to the story. So Stella Gibbons was a prolific and very successful author perhaps best known for her comic story, Cold Comfort Farm, published in 1932. I've lost and rebought copies of that book all my life. It's one of the funniest books I've ever read. And it's always going to be a book I have on my bookshelf, you know. It's a fantastic story. So if you don't know Cold Comfort Farm and you want to have some side-splitting entertainment, I would go and get yourself one. So Stella Dorothea Gibbons was born on 5th January 1902 in Camden Town, London, and died 19th December 1989 in Hampstead, London. So she was a London girl. So born into a middle-class family, Gibbons' early years were marked by domestic turmoil. Her father, Dr. Telford Gibbons, was a struggling physician, a doctor, a family doctor, whose practice in the working-class neighbourhoods of London provided young Stella with early exposure to the harsh realities of urban poverty. This experience, coupled with her father's mercurial temperament, that's a nice way of putting it, and financial mismanagement and his drinking problem, cast a long shadow over her childhood and would later inform her sharp observations of class dynamics and family dysfunction in her writing. So those are two common themes in her writing: the pervasiveness and horribleness of the English class system, and the families themselves. I mean, Cold Comfort Farm, to go back to that, it's raised to an absurd level, the family disunity in that, but it's still really, really funny. So she loved books from an early age. She was educated at home until her teenage years, which allowed her imagination to flourish. It's not that we're supporting homeschooling, we're just noting it. I went to school. There's pros and cons, of course. I mean, I met a lot of my friends at school. I had a great time being socialised at school. It wasn't an opportunity for me to be homeschooled. I'm not against homeschooling, I think, but you have to weigh it against the lack of social opportunity to meet other kids, which is a really important thing about being a human being, because you tend to have to spend most of your life with other people and to know how to deal with them. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with this. Her formal education at the North London Collegiate School for Girls was transformative, you see, exposing her to a rigorous academic environment and fostering her literary talents. Gibbons' subsequent studies in journalism at University College London further honed her writing skills and provided her with the tools to observe and critique society with provision. Her career in journalism, which included stints as a drama and literary critic, reporter and fashion writer, served as a training ground for her future novels, teaching her to distill complex social observations into pithy and engaging prose. We talk about Cold Comfort Farm, 1932, remains her most celebrated work. Her literary output was substantial and varied. If you just take a look, she wrote a lot of books. Her ability to blend humour, even in this there's humour, and social commentary and humour out of social commentary. I think that's really important. So she's not just making kind of obvious gags. She's wryly putting forward social situations, commentary, if you like. Not commentary, but just portraying social situations and just tweaking them a little bit so that they're a tiny bit absurd. She, is known for her genuine empathy. I think that's true about this story as well, that there is empathy for... Is it Mrs. Corder, the help? Maybe she doesn't get any empathy. Maybe she doesn't deserve any. But everybody else, we do feel a little bit. Even the ex-husband, or the deceased, the late husband, I felt that. Anyway, so there aren't really many studies available of this short story, Listen to the Magnolias. So I had to do my own, imagine that. So this is really very much my take on it. It's not, very often, what I'll do is I'll read other people's points of view of these stories and I'll kind of take them into account. And I'll usually give my feelings, but I'll be led by what the great and the good say, the experts. But because there aren't any, I had to kind of go out on a limb and make them up myself. So Listen to the Magnolias offers a poignant glimpse into the life of an English woman during World War II. Published in the anthology A Different Sound, this is where I got it, edited by Lucy Scholes with the copyright. The story itself has a copyright date in 1954. I found it very difficult to find actual publication details of it. I looked on the Internet Archive and all sorts. The story was likely written between 1944 and 1954. I think it's set in 44 during the build-up of American troops in the UK prior to D-Day. when they were billeted. So she could have written it up until the date of 54, or we don't know exactly when. It certainly refers to that. The narrative structure of the story, it's really small story. So in time, it begins on the same evening. It begins in the middle of the night and it ends in the morning, just after a few hours. Now, she extends that by a kind of lengthy flashback series, which gives us a couple more weeks of anxiety. And geographically, it's in one house. It's in a few rooms, really, of the one house. So it's really small. I think that's probably deliberately done because what she's trying to show, and what I think she does really successfully, is the smallness of English culture, particularly then, maybe, particularly in those social groups, but particularly, as I said, during the Second World War. But it's small, isn't it? And the things that she worries about are minor compared with what was happening in the rest of the world. People in Europe and Asia were being bombed, tortured, everything. And the soldiers were going out and having huge experiences, but not her. She is, and there must have been lots of people like this, and she's in a small town. She's not even in one of the major urban centres, which is going to get a lot of Luftwaffe bombing. So there she is. So she worries about disturbances, this routine, this life that we see. I don't know if she even realises how stifling it is, but and she has her help come in, who's clearly working class and envious of whatever small wealth this woman has. Now, I don't know what her politics was, but she was familiar from where she'd been brought up with her father of the grinding poverty of the working classes in England in the first half of the 20th century. But she's not massively sympathetic, or Mrs. Corder isn't portrayed particularly sympathetically. And as I say, it might be a class analysis, or it might be just that Mrs. Corder is just not very nice. Anyway, so we start off with the worry, and she does this ellipsis thing whereby she doesn't tell you she doesn't actually, there's these sounds and they're not explain what they are at first, and so she does this withholding of information. We're like, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? And only as the story progresses does it become clear. I think her protagonist in this, I would say she's a town mouse. And she's representative of a certain class and lifestyle in English society. And she reminded me of T.S. Eliot's poem, J. Alfred Prufrock, where he's talking about, dare I eat a peach, dare he comb his hair, dare he wear his trousers rolled up. This hesitancy and fear of living fully. So I think this is the respectability angle, to be respectable, to fit in. Actually, I just had a thought about Japanese culture, very socially cohesive places. Certainly the UK was like that. And you didn't want to live your life fully in case you were disapproved of. And you kind of interjected that so that that you yourself, it wasn't just other people's disapproval. It was your life was fairly dismal, but you didn't like any interruptions. And here come these big brash Americans, those terrible Yanks. It made me laugh actually, because as I was thinking, many people listening to this story will be Americans, and they may take it as an anti-American story, but I think it's absolutely not that at all. Anyway, so we have T.S. Eliot's J. Alfred Prufrock, and he lives a banal half-life. And then we think, jumping forward to 1973, Roger Waters wrote the lyrics from Pink Floyd's Time. Hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way. The song is gone, the time is over, thought I'd something more to say. So even in 1973, this was recognisably a very English way of living. And we think of, there was a television guy, a comedy, Victor Meldrew in the British TV series One Foot in the Grave, and he is a small-minded man, irritated by any disruption to his safe but tedious routine. she is like that. So I think her characterization, and she's not portrayed as a nasty person, she's just frightened of life, isn't she? And I think that is made to stand for the whole culture. This characterization serves to highlight the stifling nature of English middle-class life. I keep going back to my notes during the period. Gertrude, the maid, shows some courage and goes and volunteers to go and work in a canteen serving troops, and she's killed for her courage, really. And the other thing I want to say, of course, these American boys, and then she melts and she thinks, well, you know, people have been nice to our boys and the British boys, and maybe, you know, and she starts to think, well, actually, maybe they aren't these interloping monsters, but they're real people. And of course, historically, we have to acknowledge, without the USA's intervention, the British Empire, as it was, had stood alone against Hitler. Gallant resistance in France and Poland, Greece, you know, and in Europe, but it was the only state standing against Hitler, and then the Americans came in and Hitler's big mistake attacking the Russians. The Russians were quite happy to be pals with Hitler. Really, they chopped up Poland, but then he attacked them, so they became our allies by default, really. But the Americans saved Europe. You may then, the very interesting geopolitical issues afterwards, how the Americans post-war made damn sure that the British Empire was dismantled, for better or for worse. They wanted to make sure it was knackered. And so, yeah, okay. Comments to that, please. But that's true, I think. Then at the end of this short story, they subvert her expectations of what they might be. They're clean, they polish everything. The house has a warmth and a life that it's never had before. They're polite, and they bring colour in every sense, because they're black soldiers, and which would be to the drabness of, in those days, monocultural, rural or suburban England would be, wow. You know, even when I was growing up, it was monocultural. The only people we ever saw were people who were exactly like us, and the only accents we ever heard. I remember, you know, I'm from the northwest of England, from Cumbria, and if we would hear our own accent, very occasionally we hear a Geordie or a Scouser or a Scot or a Northern Irish person, Lancastrians. That was it. I remember once sitting in a pub and hearing some Cockneys, and we were like, whoa, what's that? So it was a very small world, and it would have even been perhaps more so in the 1940s. So I thought it was really nicely done, and it shows how perhaps this one event of these soldiers coming into her house was the one colourful incident in her whole life. You can imagine her living this life when they're there that's very different, and she's so enriched by it. But when they go, we can imagine, and you know, you get back in the post-war years, the 50s, where everybody was on rationing and nothing, there was no money, and she perhaps sank into that previous life of quiet desperation until she died. Anyway, but I think it was lovely because, what if there is any message? It's like, very often people you anticipate are going to be trouble are actually good for you. That's what I found. I used to find out when I was working. We'd get, on paper, somebody be coming and they were violent, unpleasant criminals. And we thought, they're just coming to blag drugs. I used to be a psychiatric nurse. And there were, you think, right, so I might get assaulted here, or certainly verbally abused or whatever. And then you'd walk in, that did happen, but you walk in and these people who on paper were dreadful turned out to be really nice. It's a funny old world. Anyway, I hope you liked that. I liked it.